All right, and we have a presentation here, item number 10, a link between the duration of coastal red tide blooms and riverine nitrogen loads in Southwest Florida. And Steve Suau from Carbon-Life, LLC, and Jennifer Hecker will be available for questions afterwards, but Steve will be presenting this for us today. And this presentation will share findings from a joint research effort and recent publication looking at intensification factors of harmful blooms. The project examined relationships between land-based nitrogen loads and red tide events in Southwest Florida. And this relates to Water Quality Improvement Action 5.1, support harmful algal bloom research and monitoring, and measures to reduce their environmental, social, and economic impacts through the identification and reduction of anthropogenic influences. All right, thank you, Steve.
Morning. Steve Suau. I'm a member of the Technical Advisory Committee, also professional engineer and hydrologist. I'm here on behalf of the team. I want to acknowledge them, and probably in particular Lenny Landau, who is a retired engineer that's been looking at red tide and continues to look at red tide from every different angle. And he shares a lot of his research with me. Some of it is a dead end, but at one time he was trying to correlate to rainfall and not getting anywhere. And I got to thinking, well, it's really runoff and the loads that are associated with them that might help explain the nutrients, if there's any link. So we worked on this about a year ago and came to some interesting conclusions, surprising conclusions in some ways. And I shared the information with Dr. Tomasco and Jennifer and Dave Tomasco, who helped prepare this presentation along with Jennifer, graciously offered to get the research formatted and published in peer review, which has happened since then. And then Miles Padina, who you probably all know, brilliant statistician. He's been looking at a lot of this as well, and he helped really clean up the paper and manuscript before it went in. So it was really a good team effort. And so everyone acknowledges, understands that red tide is naturally occurring along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. You can see that from some of the post-Ian, how it had moved from Charlotte Harbor and up the west coast of Florida into Sarasota Bay, which really was the area that we kind of initially focused on for this research. Also from satellites, there's really good indications of watershed loads coming in, runoff that carries high nutrients to the Gulf of Mexico after different satellite imagery. So here's the premise. It's acknowledged that humans don't cause red tide; it's naturally occurring. However, if it's initiated out in the Gulf and if it is moved in towards the shoreline, then land-based or anthropogenic nutrients, both natural and anthropogenic, can potentially have an effect on red tide. And so our hypothesis was simply that the amount of, in this case, nitrogen, we did look at other nutrients or other forms, but mainly nitrogen was the main one, that the pounds of tons of nitrogen that are put in to the Gulf of Mexico can affect how long red tide lasts. So that's it, no more, no less. And so that's what we looked at. And there's been recent studies that have shown that by Dr. Medina is one of them, and Dave Tomasco as well. So this is kind of the study area, which is it goes from the southern end of the Charlotte Harbor NEP to the northern end of the Sarasota Bay NEP. And there's a lot of data points that have been collected, particularly since I think 2006 or 2007. Data is collected pretty much daily. So there's a lot of points, both when there's red tide and when there's not, to kind of see what's going on. So we're able to access all of that data. And the areas that are colored in the watershed both Sarasota Bay and Charlotte Harbor. Charlotte Harbor being the predominant watershed for this region. A lot of it is gauged, so that means that there's long-term data, mainly from the USGS, on how much water is going out into the waterways every day. It's continuous measurements, and there are monthly, at least monthly nutrient measurements at those same locations from either the water management districts or DEP, or in some cases, local government. And then you have this big green area, that's the Kissimmee River Basin, that kind of is as big as everything else. And of course, we know that a good amount of that water that goes into Lake Okeechobee gets released into the Caloosahatchee. I've spent most of my career up in the Sarasota area, worked all over the state, but mainly in that region. And I'll tell you, if someone had told me two years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that the discharges in Caloosahatchee could affect red tide up in Sarasota, I would have been skeptical. But I'm not so much anymore, because I've actually spent some time looking at all the data, and I'm just really surprised how much water and nutrients, nitrogen is coming out of Lake Okeechobee and Caloosahatchee in the Gulf. So like I mentioned, the study period we looked at was from 2007 through 2022, because the red tide data is really pretty robust during that period. Before that, it's not so much, so it's hard to kind of really make a lot of sense of it. But since 2007, it's collected pretty much every day, more or less. So we looked at two thresholds of the Riverine concentration, one at 100,000 cells per liter for 30 days or more, and one at 10,000 cells per liter for 30 days or more, to define what a red tide bloom is in terms of duration, when it starts and when it stops. Then, Dave goes into detail on this. The 20-day exceedance, the 5 days no data below threshold, following 20 days of exceedance. So there is some latitude in terms of when measurements are taken, and I'll tell you that when you go through the data, it's pretty much taken every day. But then you'll see, it's not unusual to see 2 days every week where there's no data, and that's typically the weekends. So yeah, there are instances where it is measured on the weekends, but typically the data will show those 2 days every week that there may be no data because it's not being collected over the weekend. So when you plot all those concentrations out at log scale, it on a graph, you can kind of see when the blooms have occurred. And over that period, we identified 12 blooms that exceeded the 10,000 counts per cell, or cells per liter, and was able to pretty clearly see and go into the data and determine approximately when it started and when it stopped from the red tide data. So for threshold 1, which was 1,000 cells per liter, during that period, we identified 11 events that were from over 30 days, from 30 days to 475 days, and 12 events that were over the 10,000 threshold that were from 31 to 458 days. And as I mentioned, there were days with no data, about 23%, and if you consider weekends, that's about 29% of the days. So that's typically where the no data fell, but it got picked up on each side of that week. So this is the other part of the equation. So what these graphs show on the top are the hydraulic loads, which is basically whatever the units are. I think it's in metric units, but acre feet or cubic meters of water that's being discharged in all those locations. Mm-hmm. They are color coded by watershed. So we looked we basically look at 5 watersheds. The Peace River where it's gauged, Joshua Creek where it's gauged, Forest Creek where it's gauged, the Caloosahatchee River at its downstream gauge, and the Myoc River. And so these are all color coded on the top graph. The red is the Caloosahatchee, inclusive of the lead Okeechobee discharges. So you can see from, and the blue, I think, is Peace River, which is kind of the second order magnitude. But you can see from the red that that's a real significant part of the load, probably 50% of all, almost as much as all the others combined. And the bottom graph is the pounds of nitrogen, or in this case, I think it's metric tons. So that's simply multiplying the concentration times that volume to get the load. And the load is tied to both things, concentration and volume. So if you want to reduce nitrogen load, you could go for either one. The unique issue in this instance is that a lot of that load is coming from an off-site source, being the discharges in Caloosahatchee. So it's not even really part of the watershed, but it's adding a lot. Just by adding all that water, it's got nitrogen in it, you're dramatically increasing the load. But one of the key things you can see here is that they look pretty similar. And you can see the dynamics seasonally, even annually, in the different loads. So the 2017, 2018, that's Irma. And at the very beginning, you see we were in a severe drought, 2006, 2007. So you can see how dynamic it is, but in the wet season in particular, how overwhelming the amount of water is, even compared to other times of the year. Way more than any minimum flow amount. So the relationship between loads and event durations, the total loads and the hydraulic loads were both compared to the duration of red tide. The TN and hydraulic loads were based upon, so what we looked at was a window of time, 30 days of nitrogen load or hydraulic load, we looked at both, 30 days before the start of red tide and 30 days after, okay? And the reason is that's like the initial fuel to get this thing going. Nitrogen that's just already kind of sitting out there for the past 30 days or the previous 30 days, and what's there after the bloom starts in particular. And the hypothesis again that the total nitrogen loads during the initial phase of the bloom are the most important in terms of getting red tide going and how long it might last. So these are the results for both thresholds for the total nitrogen loads. And what we initially found was when we looked at all 5 of those watersheds together, we got a correlation factor of about 0.4 or 0.5, which is not bad. But then we decided to just look at Caloosahatchee by itself, and that correlation jumped way up to over 75% correlation. So indicated that that's kind of what's driving that first graph when you're looking them all together. Because then when we looked at the other 4 by themselves without Caloosahatchee, it fell apart. We didn't gain a correlation definitively that we could say the nitrogen from all the other watersheds has the same impact on the duration of red tide. And we saw the same thing when we just looked at hydraulic loads alone. So if we didn't have nitrogen concentrations to get the pounds of nitrogen, the hydraulic loads alone is a good surrogate for what's kind of going on, which kind of makes sense when you saw the previous graphs of what those different loadings are and how similar they are. So the conclusions are if red tide events are initiated offshore and then the water mass is transported towards the Florida Gulf, then these nitrogen loads that are been put out there particularly by the Caloosahatchee River can affect the duration of the red tide. The overall pattern appears to be driven by the Caloosahatchee. It's consistent with findings of Medina et al. And by the way, when we finished initially the study we were doing, people were starting, when I showed it to folks, they said, oh, you need to look at the research from Miles Medina. I didn't even know it existed. And coincidentally, he's showing a lot of the same things statistically from from some of these loads, a relationship with red tide. And again, the hydraulic load is a good surrogate as in terms of explaining what's going on. So I did want to make one last clarification on this. And again, all this does, red tide is really complex. There's the loop current, there's upwelling, there's tides, there's temperature, all kinds of factors that can affect when red tide appears, how it gets to the coast. And then when it gets to the coast, it can move, and it's all kinds of factors increase the intensity. The only thing this is correlating is the pounds of nitrogen that have been put out by the Caloosahatchee, which is kind of, I've heard it explained as a shotgun or a fire hose. It doesn't go through any estuary that can buffer all that nitrogen. With a lot of flora and fauna that can take it up. It's being released right out into the Gulf of Mexico. All this does is correlate that amount of nitrogen to how long a red tide event may last. That's it. Okay. And this does not in any way, I'm going to be real clear, suggest that other improvements to reduce excess nutrients in waterways aren't important. We have all kinds of problems, macroalgae, seagrass loss, fish kills. So all the investments and projects that are ongoing to try to address nutrient reduction, this doesn't say you shouldn't do it. What it does say is, even if you do all that, we may still have issues because of all this nitrogen being put out by the Caloosahatchee. And I think people, particularly down in this area, have known this for a while, but it's somewhat unique to folks to the north finding this out, I can tell you that. So with that, I think Jennifer wants to talk a little bit about the management and policy implications. So turn it over to her.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a bunch of different things that are worth mentioning here. First, the CCHMN, the data that has been collected by the partnership has been instrumental. I mean, really, these analysis were taking information that has been collected by all the partners and analyzing it. And so I just want to first recognize the efforts of all the different people who contribute to that and to the state database, WIN database, and all of that information is what allows scientists to be able to do analyses like this. So, we work in the CHNEP in a very broad area, covering all the way from Lemon and Don and Roberts Bays down through Charlotte Harbor into the Caloosahatchee and its estuaries, and then down to Estero Bay. So we have a variety of different issues going on in different watersheds and basins. And I think that's one of the things, we talked a lot about as co-authors, is like making sure that the message isn't that what we're doing on the local basin level to do septic to sewer, to do wastewater upgrades, all those things are still invaluable, as Steve mentioned, to protect and restore the ecological health of these systems. And we don't want people to kind of lose the forest from the trees kind of thing, and focusing on this to the exclusion of all else, because there's certainly other objectives that those other initiatives, like for instance, Sarasota Bay has been extremely successful through investing heavily on going fully to advanced wastewater treatment in seeing nutrient reductions in the bay, which are already translating to improved ecological conditions. So for that system, that's a great success story, and it shows how local projects and investments make a difference. And we want to make sure that that gets across to policymakers. So each of you has a fact sheet in your packet, and we took a lot of great care in thinking about the messaging as we roll this out, because, certainly the Caloosahatchee is a big driver, and is, as Steve pointed out, a huge contributor of nutrient loading into the Gulf waters, and as a result does have a real impact. And we do want to recognize that connection, because that is what also reinforces the need for continued investments in Everglades restoration, right? Because Everglades restoration is the master replumbing of the system that hopefully will, over time, lessen those harmfully high discharges and reduce those extreme nutrient loads that are coming down. So, here is just a graphic of the current Everglades water flow. You see that huge discharge out the C-43 down the Caloosahatchee River out into those estuaries. Some of that we know now with circulation models and looking at, actual biological indicators, as we've been talking about all morning, that water can shoot up Matlacha, go up into the east wall of Charlotte Harbor, and impact seagrasses and macroalgae growth in that area. So there's definitely a connection that was already being made that way. But also this really shows that how that nutrient loading going out to the Gulf can come in contact with Cornea brevis and really cause it to also become overabundant and last longer than it would otherwise. So that's an important piece of information for people who are working in the Everglades realm to know that we're going to have those types of benefits as we start to see more of those projects come online that will reduce those harmful flows. So here, the duration of red tide in Southwest Florida is influenced by the management of Caloosahatchee, Lake Okeechobee, and the restoration of the Everglades system will greatly help in reducing the duration of some of these extreme red tide events. And then I pointed out. Maybe you just click the answer, sorry. So, I don't have to tell you all that, this is the issue that we really saw come to the forefront of this study, that it supports that existing objectives to reduce TN loads from the Caloosahatchee River, inclusive of those Lake O discharges to the west coast of Florida, is vitally important, and that is something we just want to get across, and why we're talking to people in that realm about these findings so that they can see the connection there. And the next slide, the final point is just that policies that are more protective of Southwest Florida coastal waters and ecosystems from Lake O discharges will help to mitigate red tide. It can be seen as one of those suite of tools to try to combat red tide in our region. And we are definitely looking at, how we can, connect all the different dots of the different policies, the different projects, the different initiatives and investments, how those can all feed into reducing harmful algae blooms, whether it be red tide, whether it be cyanobacteria, which is now pretty frequent in the Caloosahatchee, or macroalgae, which we're seeing continued problems with in our area. So just trying to show the whole picture and make all those connections to all the different people who are looking at different pieces of this and may not understand how their piece is impacting another piece. That is part of what we're trying to do now in rolling this out. So we definitely would like to get your input and thoughts on this, because we are essentially in the mode now of starting to really share this information more broadly. We want to make sure that people understand it in the way that it's intended, which is as a message of hope. We have now a tool that can help actually, and I think this is something that's being looked at right now, quantify different projects, like look at the C-43 reservoir and try to determine what nutrient removal will occur, in that process of holding and treating that water. And then actually be able to determine what does that look like in reducing the duration of red tide events in the future. So that's what this now can be carried forward to do more analyses that can give us even more cost benefit information that help support the need for these continued investments. So I think that's just, I am kind of the management implications policy person on this team to try to convey that, and just, want to hear you guys. You are all experts in your own right, hear what your thoughts are and provide us feedback as we go forward with sharing this information. Steve's gonna come up here for Q&A. The data side.
So, go ahead. So this is, it's getting presented to a lot of policymakers. And, I imagine a number of them are going to be like, okay, what's the management action then? What is it that you're recommending through this based on the findings? Is the implication that we're not doing enough, we need to do more, and what is that more should be, and how do we figure out what that more is? Like that's sort of kind of snowballing of questions and whatnot. So I'm just curious, when kind of presented with that line of conversation, how are y'all responding? What's the response that you're providing to the policymakers when they bring that up? Just to kind of get an idea of sort of, what we think that their takeaways might be when they're interacting with us.
The paper was very intentional in not identifying any specific solution, other than as Jennifer said, the policy around the protection of the West Coast of Florida, there probably needs to be policies that are more protective of it from these discharges. The East Coast seems to be more effective right now, up to now, in trying to reduce the excess discharges. I think that the West Coast is getting anywhere from 50 to 60% of the water that's coming out of Lake Okeechobee. But for the MFL, that has to be met, which is not, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of water. My personal view is the West Coast of Florida needs to get as active in protecting our coastline as the East Coast has gotten from the St. Louis.
So then the takeaway from advocacy.
To build on that, the C-43 reservoir.
Can't take
was
the same order as us.
I know Phil's like he's that was designed to attenuate flow, to capture some of the high discharge, but really for the purpose of feeding that amount of water back to the river in low flow conditions. So it was really a flow project. And there were people that were concerned about not wanting the water while it was held in the reservoir to incubate algae root, and so there was concerns about water quality and making sure that the water returned to the river was not going to in any way exacerbate conditions in the river. And so they did pursue way different cost-effective options and came up with alum injection as the treatment method for trying to precipitate out some of the nitrogen and, treat that water before it's re-released. But I do think that, again, what this highlights is that, well, first of all, that the volume, if you go back to Steve's presentation, you saw the hydraulic load was pretty much on par with the actual nutrient load. And so the volume is key, and I think we're continuing to work on projects like the EAA reservoir and things to help move more water south rather than west, which will help over time. And then the LOSUM that just got approved is also, helping to manage the lake in a way that hopefully will reduce some of the harmful discharge volume. But the quality is also the other piece of the puzzle of how do we do more to treat this water as it's coming into the system through the C-43 canal to the river. Capturing and treating is going to be a continued challenge of trying to figure out more opportunities to do that. There's Lake Kipkachee and really I'm going to turn it to build add a couple of additional things. There's a lot going on, but I think we know that all those things combined, that there might be even more beyond that ultimately needed to completely stop the discharges at the harmfully high. We want to have some flow during the dry season. The river is connected to the lake and needs some flow. But it's these just high volume nutrient-laden discharges that are the issue, and these things will help. But even when they're done, I think we're trying to paint a vision that there may be even more beyond that will ultimately need to be considered. I don't know if you have any other things to add, Bill.
Yeah, so just Steve, for your information, East Coast versus West Coast. The West Coast gets more because the system is designed and we have the capacity to take more. You can't send those same volumes to the East Coast. You just flood everybody out. That's a little small river is the primary location over there. So, and Brandon, you're talking about policymakers. What's the solution? Well, it's Everglades restoration and implementation of basin management action plans. So on average, I think it's 60% of the water flow and the nutrients that come out, inclusive of lake discharges, 60% of it is the watershed. So Everglades restoration is going to address a lot of the storage needs, but not as much the nutrient needs. And so we really need to make sure that we get the BMPs, or basin management action plans, implemented to try to address some of the local watershed, the Caloosahatchee watershed, what drains in over there. A lot of storage is needed because of all the ditching and drainage that's occurred. The C43 reservoir is part of it, but we need like 2 more of those to address all the storage needs in the Caloosahatchee watershed itself. Nitrogen's our problem. We can clean phosphorus all day long. You can build a filter marsh and clean all the phosphorus out, but nitrogen, how do you remove the nitrogen? And that's the big challenge. At the C43 reservoir, you mentioned using alum. Well, that was found to be the best, the simplest, the most cost-effective, the best solution for dealing with the water that's in the reservoir. Now, the reservoir is just a little bit of the water that's coming down there, and there's a little bit of the nutrients. And so we will be incorporating that over there, but we've got a longer-term project underway along the Caloosahatchee at the Boma property, and it's a nutrient removal project. We bought 1,600 acres over there. Lee County helped purchase that land with us, and we've been studying ways of removing nitrogen, not all nutrients, but just focusing on nitrogen. And we did a bunch of test cells out there, and we actually are putting it in the ground now. There's a couple hundred acres where we're putting it in the ground, and we're using plants, natural-based solutions right there. And they're actually going to start planting, I think, this month over here on this test cell. So we started out in little containers. Now we're putting it in the ground to give it a shot and see what works best. And then ultimately it'll be expanded to the whole 1,600 acres if this combination of plants works over there. But that'll go a long way. We'll then have hopefully we'll find a mechanism for removing nitrogen. I mean, everybody says we need more filter marshes, we need more treatment, but that doesn't really address our nitrogen problem. What the technologies that are out there today, and so there's a lot going on. As you mentioned, LOSM is going to have a big impact that'll help should reduce the discharges that we'll see coming out of the lake. There's a lot of projects underway north of the lake to try to clean some of that water. And then there's a number of projects within our watershed, and within the next few months, we'll be kicking off two bigger projects, storage projects in the Caloosahatchee watershed, and the C43 reservoir hopefully we'll be testing it and operating it next year this time. So.
If I can add something, so from the management, that's really good. From a management standpoint, something that was noted is that red tide initiates typically in September and October, probably 75% of those events. That's when it started. If you wanted to look at all of them, they can occur as early as June times if the temperature is cool enough, and they can start in November at times. So the window of time from a management standpoint to reduce discharges would be 30 days before and 30 days after, which would be May through December. That's if you reduce discharges from January to May, that's not going to do anything because we never get red tide events that would be affected by that nitrogen. And those are when it's relatively low flow and you need the minimum flow, I'm assuming anyway. But the real effective time from a management standpoint of red tide would be from May through December.
Hurricane season.
Yeah.
All over the lake. because they're getting ready to build. So it is a conundrum, and that's why storage outside the lake. And I thought you brought up an excellent point, and I totally failed to mention was the VMAP and half of the loading coming from the watershed. And so it's distributed storage and treatment, which we talked about for years. I mean, it needs to just continue to progress where we capture and store more of the water elsewhere outside of the river. So that hopefully will, to get to your point, reduce what's going on during these peak periods.
Take more south.
Well, that's coming. That's coming.
Yeah.
No, we've been ditching and draining the state of Florida for 150 years, and, everybody wants it fixed overnight. And we did it. And why did the Corps build all that? Because the local communities in the state of Florida said, do it, help, please come in there and do that. And so they did it at the request of the West Coast and the East Coast and the heartland there. And, we're living with it now.
An incredible restoration. Public opinion changes over time, and work has adapted over time. So is the districts.
If I may, that's getting to what I was trying to drive at with my question here, is I think I would advocate that the messaging here, when you're talking to the policy people, is about staying in the course on what's been identified as what needs to be done, and less advocate for the West, not the East, because I think one of the big pain points with the LOSA negotiations was that it turned into this West Coast versus Lake people versus East Coast. And you had a lot of energy devoted to that conflict rather than working together to identify solutions. And so if you go into, like, say, environment where you're presenting to a coalition of representatives from these different groups, and you're like, we need to advocate more for the West Coast, then the Lake people are going to lose their mind, because they're like, look, you're already going to kill us out with LOSIM, because you're already going to, kill all the littoral vegetation, and now you want to do more harm to us, blah, blah, blah. So to try to kind of nip that whole line of thing in the bud and making it more about sort of this collaborative, we're identifying these other things, and especially in light of how expensive everything is getting. Seeing our revised figures, what AWT is going to be costing us in the county, I think it's going to become even more important message that whole state of course thing, and the importance of avoid all these things. So that's just kind of throwing.
Yeah, and then the big message is those investments are worthwhile in more ways than we even thought.
Right.
Because now there's this added benefit of potentially reducing the red tide duration.
So the difference between this study and the 2022 study, did this focus more on measuring duration specifically, increased duration?
So this developed actual metrics, if you will, of from the data, you can tell when the red tide events start and stop, the duration. So it's something to be determined quantitatively, and the nutrient loads are also measured. So there's no real models or estimations involved here. It's all based upon data that's been collected. And I think that the 22 study was with very high level statistics that tried to correlate all kinds of things, the intensity of red tide, its persistence. And so I don't think there are any metrics specifically identified, just statistics that show that there's a relationship between the nitrogen in particular loads and its relationship to red tide in general. But Miles would be the one to speak more to that. And I agree, it's not an East Coast, West Coast thing. It's great what the East Coast has done. But I think that the West Coast, and I say this from someone north of this region, has never really thought, the Everglades and lose a hedge, that's a problem, but that's someone else's problem. It has potentially an impact all the way up to Tampa Bay. And so the West Coast of Florida has an interest in having as protective policies as the East Coast does, not to loosen those, but we should have as protective policies in moving forward.
I was just wondering, and I believe that was mentioned earlier, the concentration of total nitrogen in the Caloosahatchee compared to Mayaka and Peace? Was there ever that type of comparison in the loads and concentration? I recall 10 times more in.
Well, so one of the metrics that I like to look at is what I call the unit load, which is the load divided by the area. Okay, it's really biased
Right.
for the Caloosahatchee because you've got all this external load coming in. So when you divide that
It's just,
total load, which includes all the releases from Lake Okeechobee, it's 3 times more than what typically you would see. You typically see about 3 pounds per acre. It jumps up to 10 pounds per acre for the Caloosahatchee because you've got all the releases that are being added to the same geographical watershed boundary. So when you divide it by that acreage, it's so much higher. The concentrations between the different watersheds, the total nitrogen concentrations, I don't remember them being dramatically different, but they probably are higher, from Lake Okeechobee, a little bit higher than
They were, I mean, they were roughly
Yeah,
comparable. That's what goes to that point of like,
Yeah,
it really wasn't that the chemistry was that different, it was the volume that increased the load. And that kind of goes to this,
that's what that shows.
graph to, you see that they're pretty much parallel.
And if I may, just a quick follow-up, that's probably Phil may be a great person to ask. With the C43 and alum usage, has this product been used on such large scale? And have we considered, the negative effects of alum, such as pH decrease and the toxicity of aluminum? I've done some work on smaller water bodies, and the quantity of alum that you would need to reduce the nutrients was incredibly, large, and I could not even comprehend how much will it need to make a difference there. So I'm a bit concerned about the negative effects of aluminum. So
Yeah, they definitely looked at that in, what we did. So, but I think the quantities that we're putting in there are not really that huge. We're not trying to remove all the nitrogen out of it. That's not the goal. It's just to knock it down some. And I know they've taken a look at it, and over a 10-year period at the bottom of the reservoir, there's going to be just a couple of millimeters of alum that precipitates out at the bottom after like a 10-year period. And that's in part because the reservoir is huge. It's 18 square miles. It's 6 miles across. So, that's a big area over there. So, but yeah, that was all considered and looked at as part of it. We did a big feasibility study looking at all numerous alternatives, projects that could be done over there.
Kind of comment, well, first, just thank you so much for that work. It's excellent. Thank you. But now that you have the smoking gun, because it's the Caloosahatchee River discharges are probably the main one. Isn't that time for us to start determining what part of the Caloosahatchee River is briny? It's not just the Okeechobee. I mean, we're talking a lot of basins, and including, I'm sorry to offend you, but Head Coral, Coral has a 84 miles, that's a lot of input. And it's time to start finding the point source. Because we're talking non-point source, no, but find the point source and start really implementing the DMPs.
So that is there are multiple TMDLs for the Caloosahatchee River that isolate the different sections and come up with a load limit. And actually, there are basin management action plans, as Phil mentioned, that then look at all the contributors in each of those segments and proportionally allocate what level of reduction each of them needs to achieve to meet that collective reduction goal that's outlined in the TMDL. So they do have an idea of, what needs to, how much is coming from which source, how much each contributor needs to reduce, and that is all laid out, and they are then basically assessing that periodically and looking at how are we progressing against that. The issue, I think, and this is something that is going to probably be forthcoming. We know some people who are analyzing this and going to probably be releasing kind of an understanding of the trend, in those areas. We do our own trends that are on the Water Atlas. You can look at like TN trends in the Caloosahatchee and see that they are continuing in some cases to increase, even though we're having load reductions. And that's because there's always new things coming online. So, it's a tricky thing because those things were done as a snapshot at one particular point where they looked at, okay, what is the load? What's the load reduction need to be? What do we need to do? And they built a plan, but meanwhile, everything keeps changing, right? And some of those changes are in some cases offsetting the advances we're making with other things, with other initiatives and other people reducing inputs. So I think it is a tricky thing that will be constantly revisited, that we are not keeping up enough to overarchingly bring the TM levels down to where they need to be. But there is efforts, many efforts to monitor that and to continually adjust the planning and the targets to make us move in the right direction. And there's new things like the statewide stormwater rule. I mean, we knew that stormwater standards 15 years ago that they were only capturing about 40% of the nitrogen that each new development was generating. And so you can imagine as we continue to develop, where that all ends up going and adding to the load. So hopefully those new regulations, as those come into effect, there's a lot of things moving in the right direction, but we're not yet seeing that play out in the data and the trends. But hopefully we will start to see that.
This was making sure I was still with them.
It's been going for so many years now, like, oh, surprise, that's.
So my comment would be to, while you're rolling this out, as you say, with this data, and the data speaks for itself and is interesting for sure. But it's such a complicated thing with Lake Okeechobee for the general public to wrap their head around. So I would just be really careful, pointing your finger at the lake without parsing this out with some CFS flow coming from the lake to really back that up. Because, for 15 or 17 years now, the general public just regurgitates the same old discharges language in Lake Okeechobee, and they'll be saying this to me at times when we're not receiving any water from the lake. So I just would hope that we could maybe just, and also the timing of this with LOSUM coming online and with them trying to be LOSUM-like for the last 2 years in their management strategies. There's a lot changing right now with that. So I would just try to be super educated and careful about the way that you present this data, making such a big connection with the discharges, like that image you show, that could have very easily been, we were getting 10,000 CFS just from our basin this past year. It had zero to do with lake water. So be careful.
That's a good point.
And, sorry.
Kind of going off of that, in the 3 nitrogen scenarios in the study, were there lake releases at a time? I just didn't catch that. Or like the 3 scenarios that you looked at, what was happening with the lake at that time? Or was it just like a
So
modeling?
the discharges are inclusive of both. So they haven't been split apart. And the presumption, I'm semi-retired hydrologist, okay, and a resident of Florida. And what I hear from people is, well, why don't we just fix the Everglades and take water south to Florida Bay and not take it where it didn't used to go to feed Wesco. And that just seems too simple, but it's, you know, the point is that Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee River were not historically connected other than maybe at high flow down Lake got up high enough. So all of that load that's coming is artificial. And so, yeah, the nutrient loads, PMDLs and the Caloosahatchee should be addressed just like every other watershed. But you talk about a point source, there's nothing like that. No other point sources like the discharges from the Caloosahatchee. And they represent, I think what I saw was they represent about 50% of the total load out of Caloosahatchee on average, an average annual basis, which is a really significant number. So I understand the complexity of the Everglades, especially for people like Phil and Jennifer and several of you that have been dealing with it for decades. But, you know, we've spent a lot of time and money on Everglades restoration. And I think we've got a lot more time and money to spend to get there. That's my opinion.
Did that answer your question or?
I agree with what you're saying, but I'm just trying to understand in the study what the different scenarios were. Do you have more?
Scenarios, so there were different thresholds. There's the 10,000 cell count and the 100,000 cell count.
Mhm.
And then there was within each of those looking at, again,
Total
to
nitrogen and hydraulic,
hydraulic
that's the driver.
and then the 30-day window on each side of the events to try to tease out what is an event
Mhm.
when you look at the spikes. So I'm not sure.
Do you have a full copy of the study? Maybe we could.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, on the fact sheet, there's a
Okay.
QR code right there.
Okay.
And that takes you to the full journal article. But if
Okay.
you have follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And
Okay.
we're in contact with all the extra co-authors.
Great, great.
So we can just get you a response.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Viviana?
I think part of the question and something that I was thinking about too is maybe so Steve, what you're saying is historically they were not likely connected except at times of high flow. So thinking about that time frame, there was still loading coming from Caloosahatchee. And so I think the question is, what does that load look like versus now that it is connected? There's this additional load above and beyond. And so do we know what that looks like? And I think the answer, we do know.
We do.
Okay.
That's in the TMDL because they tease that out, the natural load from the anthropogenic load when they set the TMDL reductions, because they're not trying to reduce any natural. That comes off the top. They calculate that and remove that and trying to figure out who should reduce by what amount. So we do have a quantified amount for the natural pre-development load.
Phil, you'd probably be the best to answer. What percentage of the average annual load out of Caloosahatchee is on an average annual basis from the Okeechobee?
Oh, it's half. It's roughly half.
Yeah.
It's less, over the last 30 years, and it varies from year to year, depending on how wet it is, but I think it's about 60% is from the watershed, 40% from Lake Okeechobee. And Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation just did a study, and they essentially came up with the same information that we've been putting out there. So, but I'm pretty sure it's around 60% is the watershed and 40%. Some years it'll flip flop,
Mhm.
but in other years it may be, it just depends on how wet it is and what the Corps is doing. The last several years they've been doing, trying to mimic what's coming out in Losum, which is less discharges. So we've been seeing less water coming out over the last couple of years, and hopefully that'll continue the next, into the future. Mhm.
It was, yeah, like you mentioned, I mean, it's roughly half at 60-40 and it can flip flop based on what's happening in either system, but I think that's the message, is that there's almost an equal shared responsibility.
Yeah, and the other thing too, West Coast has been asking for water from Lake Okeechobee. So even during the dry periods, we're asking, send us that water. We know it's full of nutrients, but we need to have that fresh water to keep the estuary healthy and alive. So, So, the water comes from the lake every year. Sometimes there's a lot, sometimes there's very little. So, but yeah, it just kind of varies. So.
So it's really complicated, but to your point, Viviana, it's roughly an even split almost.
Yeah, I guess hearing from all these comments about that, could that be a caveat to the study is that if this was based on the flows and loading at S79, that maybe with this other watershed influence, that maybe the nitrogen loading is even higher than we know, and the correlation's even higher. So maybe that could just be kind of like wrapped in at the bottom of like, we know there's additional loading further down in that river basin.
Yeah,
Where the gauge,
yeah, you're talking about being able to distinguish better.
yeah, there is a,
Oh, yeah.
Was S79 the last
If you go
flow?
back to one of the original pictures of the watersheds. Go back.
Yeah.
There. Those light blue,
Okay.
are the, see the round dots
Mhm.
that are outlined in black? Those are the discharge gauge and sampling sites where they're co-located. Those were essentially the main areas that we were thinking for the 5 river systems. So that helps to help you visualize the one at the close sheet.
Love.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to dig further into the lake impacts and you pull S77 in the future study and say, okay, what's coming from S77 and how does that correlate with, time, whatever, and then you're isolating, Okeechobee influence versus watershed versus.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And that information's all out there.
Yeah, right.
Even an estimate from downstream of where the Franklin Lock is right there. So it captures the Fort Myers, Cape Coral, Lehigh. There's even numbers for that.
Yeah.
Nutrient and volume loads. So.
Do those have names or numbers?
Are there any stream gauge down there? Is it just nutrient?
No, that area downstream of
Yeah.
Franklin Lock, there's nothing down there, so it's just modeled based upon some stream gauges that have occurred over there that have been out there. So, and we do recognize that. I forget the name of that watershed over there, but when we look at the Caloosahatchee, we got like the east and the west.
I think we are done on time, but thank you both for presenting and providing all the information. And yeah, if you have any additional questions once you read that paper, please reach out to the authors. Right.
I guess if you want
If it will let.
It's a cooperative.
Yeah, I think the animation.
Yeah. More
Yep, there's the fact sheet with the QR code to the article. If, again, you'd like to read it over and reach out if you have additional questions. And there's no action item.